Hello everyone, and welcome to our 8th Bite-sized Learning module we're filming as part of our Modern Slavery Impact Initiative. These are a series of conversations we're having with leading experts throughout Australia, unpacking key modern slavery risk issues for Australian businesses. And the series has been made possible through the support of the Australian Government through the National Action Plan to Combat Modern Slavery 2020 to 2025. My name is Caskey, and I look after the human rights programming at the UN Global Compact Network in Australia. And it's my pleasure to be here at UTS today with Bassina Farbenblum, Associate Professor of the Faculty of Law and Justice at UNSW, and Laurie Berg, Associate Professor at UTS Faculty of Law, both co-executive directors of the Migrant Justice Institute. Thank you so much for being here, guys.
Thanks for having us.
So today we're going to be talking about migrant workers in Australia, and in particular, Laurie, I want to start with you. Can you tell us a little bit about the migrant worker landscape in Australia and how we got there?
Sure. So, Australia doesn't think of itself as a country with a large number of guest workers or migrant workers, but in fact, there are over 1 million temporary visa holders that are working in Australia at any one time. And that comes up to about 7% of the national labour market. Naturally, many of them are, earning very high wages in corporate jobs, sort of employed by their employers, sponsored by their employer sponsor. Mm-hmm. But there are many others who may be asylum seekers, international students, backpackers, seasonal workers from the Pacific Islands who are doing much more low-paying jobs and low-skilled jobs. It's sort of the sorts of jobs that are done by migrant workers in other countries. And so in Australia, they're working in industries like horticulture, abattoirs, hospitality, construction, commercial cleaning. And in fact, there are probably over 100,000 undocumented workers that have lived and worked for many years in horticulture jobs. And these are people who are living in the community with us. They form the backbone of these industries that feed us and keep us well. I think that the Australian public and the government just really has overlooked the scale of temporary migrant labour in Australia, and certainly also the sort of prevalence of exploitation. And so it really probably wasn't until 2015 that migrant worker exploitation got onto the sort of national radar with the wage theft scandals at 7-Eleven stores around the country. And then, probably then not until COVID, when, obviously because of all of the labour shortages, when the borders were closed to temporary migrants coming in and those who were here were told to go home, that I think the public, we, really understood just how reliant we are on temporary migrant labour in key industries. But I think because of sort of our history of permanent settlement, it just really hasn't been understood, and certainly the drivers of exploitation haven't been understood. But I think it's this government now really, I think for the first time is grappling with migrant labour exploitation across the country.
And I feel like it's something that's becoming much more part of the conversation. People are actually starting to understand that this is an issue. I suppose, could you just tell me a little bit more about what migrant worker exploitation in Australia particularly looks like?
Sure. So, we have conducted surveys of almost 17,000 temporary visa holders in Australia over several years. That is the largest scale research of its kind that we're aware of around the world. And we have found consistently that, for example, out of thousands of international students and backpackers, around a third are paid less than half the minimum wage nationally for the casual jobs in which they're working. We've also asked about indicators of modern slavery and forced labour, of course. And so, for instance, in a survey of well over 4,000 temporary visa holders, 91 reported having their passport confiscated by their employer. 92 reported that their employer or manager had threatened to report them to immigration and potentially, lead to their removal from Australia. 173 were required to pay to obtain the job that they were working in, and 112 were required to pay cash back to their employer for their work. And so, and then, on top of that, out of all of the migrant workers who said that they knew that they were underpaid, which was the vast majority, 9 out of 10 said that they told no one. So it is clear that, like globally, migrant worker exploitation in Australia, is really in the shadows. And I mean, it's for that reason that we're planning in 2024 to conduct a new survey to try to evaluate the prevalence of exploitation in the labour market in the years since the pandemic. And in this survey, we'll be drilling down in more detail into, into the indicators of modern slavery and forced labour as well. And we hope to collect some really valuable evidence that will point to the risks of exploitation and modern slavery in supply chains, and really be able to sort of look at, which industries, which groups of workers, including nationality, visa, class, gender, and which reasons, so that we'll, really have a much better idea of where some of the worst forms of exploitation are subsisting in the economy and in supply chains.
Thanks so much, Laurie. And we'll certainly look out for the results from that survey next year. Bassina, I want to turn to you now. Just picking up on Laurie's earlier point that 9 in 10 workers didn't tell anybody?
That's right.
Bassina, can you tell us a bit more about why that's the case?
Sure. I mean, there are sort of obvious practical reasons. For example, migrant workers might not know their rights, they might not speak the language, they might not know sort of where to go or what the systems look like. But there are also much more fundamental reasons why migrant workers don't come forward, and they're the same all over the world. And essentially, it's that it's not rational for migrant workers to do anything. On the one hand, you have sort of the effort and cost involved and the risks that migrant workers face to their visa status, to their job. And on the other hand, you have generally, with most of these processes, a really low likelihood of a good outcome. And so if we look at, for example, the immigration risks to migrant workers, if you are a migrant worker who has staked so much in being in Australia, and if speaking up means you could lose your visa, or you might not be eligible for future visas, or you could be deported, that risk is so high, it would have to be really worth it for you to come forward. So you might be, say, a sponsored worker where you're on a visa sponsored by your employer. If you speak up, your employer will say, oh, thank you, off you go. You've lost your visa, you're out of the country, your pathway to permanence is gone. Everything you've staked on this disappears. If you're an international student, you might have worked more than 48 hours a fortnight. If you speak up, your visa could get cancelled. Everything you've put into your education, your family savings, gone overnight, and you would have to leave the country. And then obviously for undocumented workers, who we know are actually the most vulnerable to exploitation and modern slavery, if they're detected, they can be removed and their stay in Australia comes to an end. So the stakes are extremely high for migrant workers. And then on the other side, we know, for example, from our survey, one survey of over 4,000 migrant workers, we asked those who were underpaid whether they did anything about that, and only 3% had gone to the Fair Work Ombudsman, to the regulator. And there are sort of practical barriers to access, but I think there's also just a pessimism about whether it's worth it, because we know within the 3%, almost none of them recovered all the wages they were owed. And so at the end of the day, if you're that migrant worker faced with these choices, it's not really rational to speak up or do anything about it.
And I feel like this is it's a problem all over the world, and it sounds like it's been a problem in Australia for quite a while. What's the government doing about it?
Fortunately, the government actually has just recently committed to introducing visa protections that would enable migrant workers to safely come forward when they're exploited. So we developed a proposal called Breaking the Silence, which has been endorsed by the UN Global Compact Network of Australia and by the New South Wales Anti-Slavery Commissioner and peak ethnic community bodies, humanitarian groups and many others, which has two key proposals in it. The first is a protection against visa cancellation, where a migrant worker has breached their visa. So like those international students who may have worked more than 48 hours, if they come forward and take action to address exploitation, their visa won't be cancelled. The second is a short-term visa. So for those migrant workers who are just too scared to do anything until their stay has come to an end, it would allow them to remain in Australia for a short period if they can demonstrate that they're taking action to address exploitation. So we believe these two safeguards would really make it possible for migrant workers to safely report, and the government has committed to introducing a pilot of these protections next year. So hopefully we'll start to see some real change in this area.
Fantastic. And we know that businesses as well have been doing quite a bit of work to pull together things like grievance mechanisms and other reporting channels. Do you think some of those barriers to reporting actually still exist for those grievance mechanisms? And if so, like, what do you think businesses can do about it?
Absolutely. And I think that, I mean, unfortunately, businesses really need to understand what's at stake for those migrant workers when they're asking them to speak up, whether it's in sort of the context of a social audit or to come forward to a grievance mechanism. And I think that it's really important that businesses understand that if they're not designed in a way where it is rational for that migrant worker to take action, the vast majority won't. And it doesn't matter how many times you tell migrant workers that a grievance process is available. If it's not rational to use it, they won't. And so I guess there are a couple of things that businesses really need to think about. The first is putting yourself in that migrant worker's shoes. What are the risks? Are they, whether they're immigration risks, whether they're risks of losing a job, whether it's sort of time away from work that would have to be invested in this, or is it risk to colleagues? You know, if you speak up, are you going to put other workers at that work site in danger in terms of their immigration status? So to really think deeply about what's at stake for that worker, what's the cost for them of doing something, and then obviously see what you can put in place to try to reduce those risks. But again, a really key element of that is making sure that those are things migrant workers trust. So it's not enough to say, don't worry, it's confidential. For a migrant worker, they need to know the person telling them that is someone they trust. And so that's why working with community groups and unions is so important, because again, there's so much that migrant workers are risking. They need to know that whoever's giving them that information is a source of trust for them. And then on the other side, so if you can reduce those risks and costs to workers, there has to be a high likelihood of a good outcome, and that's remedy. That's where remedy comes into the picture. So if you're asking a migrant worker to say whether they were paid correctly, it has to be the case that if they speak up, they're going to quickly get the wages they're owed. Otherwise, why would they? And so this is why it's also so important not to think about remedy as an afterthought, which is often what businesses do. You know, when you find modern slavery, when you find exploitation, remedy kicks in. That's not how businesses need to be thinking about this. It has to be built in as a core element of sort of prevention and detection, because migrant workers aren't coming forward if there's no remedy for them. And so when you're thinking about why won't they report, you need to be looking at what's in it for them if they do.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Bassina and Laurie. That's been extraordinarily insightful and some really good key insights for businesses to take away and looking at their grievance mechanisms. And thank you all for watching today. If you'd like to learn more about the UN Global Compact, you can visit us at unglobalcompact.org.au. I'll make sure to list some of the resources that we mentioned in the discussion. So obviously the survey reports and the Breaking the Silence proposal. Thank you again very much to both of you. And of course, we were very pleased to endorse the proposal, and hopefully we see some really, really good next steps coming off of this as well.
Thanks
so much.
Thanks everyone. We'll see you next time.